The Nile flows northward through the desert, a narrow band of green laid against the sand and stone. It is not only a river, but a cycle of time itself, its seasonal rise and fall, marking the rhythm upon which ancient life depends. Each year, as rains fall far to the south in the highlands of Ethiopia, the waters swell and spread across the low floodplain. The flood leaves behind a dark, silty soil, dense with nutrients carried from distant mountains. Here, agriculture takes root, and here civilization finds its footing. Beyond the reach of the river's water, the land turns quickly to arid sand and limestone plateau. This stark boundary defines the possibilities of survival. To step away from the river's edge is to step into scarcity, where heat and dryness dominate and little can endure. Yet along this ribbon of water, communities gather sowing emmer wheat and barley, tending flax for linen, and grazing cattle on patches of renewed grass. Archaeological traces show that human settlement concentrates most densely along this fertile corridor, a clear sign of the river's centrality. The annual inundation is not always predictable. In years when the flood is too low, fields fail and harvests dwindle. In years when it is too high, water lingers, drowning seedlings and damaging homes. In this delicate balance lies both the gift and the danger of dependence on a single waterway. Ancient Egyptians measured these fluctuations with nilometers, carved stairways marked to record water levels, linking the prosperity of fields to the careful observation of rising currents. The Nile also shapes movement. Papyrus boats skim its surface, carrying goods from village to village. Granite from quarries in Aswan moves downstream to become obelisks and statues. Timber scarce in Egypt itself arrives, floated from lands farther south or east. The river is a channel of exchange, as much as a lifeline. Its steady current and northward flow offset by a reliable southward wind that allows boats to travel both directions with sail and oar. Far from the riverbanks in the desert beyond, evidence of early caravans shows attempts to cross barren expanses to reach copper, turquoise, and gold. These journeys, recorded in rock carvings and abandoned campsites, remind us of the limits of the landscape and the endurance required to push into harsher zones. Yet the majority remain near the Nile, where life is tenuous but sustainable. Archaeological finds include shell beads carried more than 100 kilometers from the Red Sea, hinting at distant trade or personal journeys across harsh terrain. Such small objects suggest a web of connections broader than the valley itself, though the roots and motivations remain debated. Was it organized exchange or occasional wandering? The record is incomplete. The uncertainty underscores the fragile nature of knowledge drawn from fragments in the sand. Climate evidence reveals that the desert once looked different. Thousands of years earlier, during the early Holocene rains, reached farther north, and broad savannas spread, where now there is only arid expanse. Rock art of giraffes and antelope remains carved into cliffs, a memory of landscapes that could once support such creatures. As the Sahara-dried populations contracted toward the Nile, concentrating in the narrow valley and shifting the balance of survival. This convergence gives the river not only practical, but existential significance. It becomes the only path to life in a drying world. Scientists still debate the precise pace of this desertification and how human groups adapted as grassland gave way to sand. Did people move gradually with each generation, or were there sudden retreats during periods of drought? The timeline is not fully resolved, though it is clear that the Nile becomes the hinge on which settlement turns. At planetary scale, these changes are linked to shifts in Earth's orbit and tilt, altering the strength of monsoon rains across Africa. What happens in the sky far above in cycles spanning tens of thousands of years dictates whether the valley can flourish or wither. In this sense, the Nile is not only a river of Egypt, but part of a global pattern of climate oscillation. Its gifts are contingent upon forces far beyond human control. Within this setting, daily life is both ordinary and precarious. Families plant as the waters recede, tending fields measured by cubits and marked by stone boundary lines. Harvest follows with sickles tipped by flint blades, tools that change little over centuries. Storage pits and granaries rise in villages, each filled with the yield that determines the chance of enduring lean seasons. Even in times of plenty, the dependence on grain is sharp. Bread and beer form the staples of diet, yet their abundance relies on the fragile sequence of flood sowing and harvest. Archaeobotanical evidence, the charred grains recovered from ancient hearths, confirms the central role of cereals and pollen records. From Nile sediments, reinforce the continuity of cultivation across centuries. Yet there is vulnerability at every stage. To live in this world is to live in tune with water cycles, to watch the river with both trust and anxiety. Alongside its practical role, the Nile acquires symbolic and spiritual weight. Hymns and inscriptions speak of its power to create life, its waters imagined as the tears of deities or the blood of cosmic renewal. While these ideas belong to later cultural layers, the roots of reverence are present in the sheer dependence visible from the earliest communities. To settle near the river is to accept its authority. The land beyond remains largely silent, but even there, hints of adaptation emerge. Wells dug in oases traces of paths, leading to stone quarries, and temporary shelters in wadis suggest human presence, but these are interruptions in a dominant pattern of valley-based life. The contrast reinforces the singularity of the Nile as a central spine. The silence of the desert stands against the continuity of the water. The mystery endures of how precisely early Egyptians coordinated their understanding of the flood. Nilometer records stretch back into antiquity, but how early systematic observation begins is less certain. Did communities at first rely only on memory and oral record, or were notched markers carved earlier than the surviving evidence suggests? The answer remains incomplete. Such uncertainty reflects the fragmentary nature of the archaeological record. What is clear is the dependency. Too much water, too little, or ill-timed floods could unravel the fragile order. Across its broad reach, the Nile ties together far-flung elements. Granite papyrus crops, livestock, human lives all converge upon its flow. At planetary scale, it is part of the hydrological network waters, ultimately drawn from distant rains that themselves arise from patterns of ocean and atmosphere. The river is not local, but global. In origin, a thread of freshwater linking equatorial storms to Mediterranean delta. To live along its banks is to participate in a chain that stretches across continents. In this way, the river that shapes time also binds places. The Nile continues northward, widening into marshes of the delta before dispersing into the sea. Here, fish and reeds offer additional sustenance, and marsh birds rise from tall grasses. Yet even at this seeming abundance, the precariousness is never far away. Salinity shifts changing channels, and encroaching sands all pose challenges. Life remains tethered to the vigilance of observation and adaptation. As the river flows, so flows the calendar of ancient life. Fields food and faith rise and fall with its waters. The story of early Egypt is the story of this annual rhythm, a rhythm that continues for millennia and defines what it means to endure in this land. In the valley of the Nile, stone rises where mud brick once suffices. Over generations, communities turn their attention not only to the cycles of sowing and harvest, but also to the permanence of structures meant to outlast the seasons. Quarries along the riverbanks yield limestone and sandstone, while granite, harder and more difficult to shape, is carried from the quarries at Aswan. Tools of copper dolerite pounding stones and patient human labor mark the surfaces of extracted blocks, each bearing traces of methodical effort. When arranged and aligned, these blocks form tombs, temples, and monuments that still command the horizon. The desert plateau just beyond the floodplain becomes a favored place for such works. There the dry air preserves, and the land elevated above shifting waters provides stable ground. At Giza, the most renowned of these structures takes shape. The Great Pyramid, rising with precision of orientation and staggering volume, reflects a combination of labor organization and astronomical knowledge. The sides align closely with the cardinal directions, suggesting careful observation of the skies. The purpose of such monuments rests in funerary tradition, ensuring continuity and provision for rulers in the afterlife, but the scale exceeds mere burial practice. It reveals a society capable of mobilizing thousands, sustaining workers with rations of bread and beer, and coordinating tasks across years and decades. Yet despite the scale, questions endure. Scholars debate the precise methods used to transport and lift the massive stones. Was it straight ramps, spiraling structures, or combinations of approaches? Evidence remains incomplete, leaving room for multiple interpretations. What is certain is the persistence of human determination against the weight of geology. The very act of shaping granite obelisks or carving temple facades affirms a commitment to permanence. Beyond pyramids, temples spread across the valley. Luxor and Karnak stand as accumulations of construction over centuries, layered with columns, courtyards, and sanctuaries. Reliefs carved into walls depict scenes of ritual processions and offerings, but also military campaigns and the symbolic triumph of order over chaos. Such imagery blends daily practice with cosmic meaning, weaving together the cycles of the Nile, the rising of the sun, and the legitimacy of kingship. The alignment of structures with solstices and celestial events further emphasizes the integration of astronomy into architecture. The temple at Abu Simbel, oriented so that twice a year the inner sanctuary is illuminated by the rising sun, demonstrates the precision with which sky and stone are joined. These alignments reveal a society attentive not only to earthly needs, but also to celestial rhythms. The sun's path, the stars rising, and the moon's cycle are embedded in the built environment, transforming stone into a calendar of light and shadow. Archaeological detail adds texture to this picture. Workers' villages near pyramid sites reveal evidence of planned housing, bakeries, breweries, and medical facilities. Ostraca, or inscribed pottery shards, record deliveries, rations, and names of work crews. These fragments remind us that monumental construction is not only the achievement of rulers, but also of ordinary laborers organized into teams with pride in their contributions. The names of crews, such as the Friends of Khufu, inscribed on blocks, testify to collective identity in the midst of immense labor. Yet mysteries remain within the stones. The decision to invest such vast resources in tombs and temples when grain harvests and irrigation also demand attention, speaks to priorities still debated. Was it primarily religious conviction, political authority, or a combination of both that sustained these projects? The balance is not easily untangled, and perhaps in the minds of ancient builders, no such division existed. To construct in stone was to ensure cosmic order and communal stability alike. At planetary scale, the monuments stand against deep time. While mud brick houses crumble and vanish into dust, limestone blocks endure through millennia. Wind and sand erode edges, yet the form persists. What remains visible today is a small fraction of the once active landscape of temples and shrines, yet enough to remind us of the scale at which ancient Egyptians conceived permanence. The very idea of shaping stone to last beyond generations reflects a consciousness of time different from daily survival. Inscriptions on temple walls reference the movement of celestial bodies. Star charts painted on tomb ceilings show constellations used to mark the passing of hours in the night. This knowledge aids in agricultural timing, but also in religious symbolism. The star Sirius, whose rising coincides with the annual inundation, becomes central in marking the calendar. The link between sky and flood is inscribed not only in practice, but in belief, binding the heavens to the river's cycle. In quieter details, the archaeological record preserves glimpses of how stonework intersects with daily life. A fragment of a mason's chisel worn from repeated use recovered near a temple foundation speaks of individual hands in the shaping of monumental visions. Graffiti left by visitors and workers alike carved into hidden walls or remote cliffs, record names, prayers, and casual remarks. These traces humanize the otherwise impersonal scale of vast stone structures, reminding us that each surface once bore the presence of many lives. The unresolved mystery of unfinished monuments adds another layer. At Aswan, a massive obelisk lies still attached to bedrock, cracked before completion. Its surface shows the method of extraction abandoned when flaws appeared. It stands as a frozen moment of labor, interrupted, a reminder of the uncertainties even in grand designs. Such remnants underscore the precarious balance between ambition and material reality. Beyond the valley, echoes of Egyptian stonework appear in far-flung contexts. Obelisks are transported to other lands in later eras, while trade routes carry carved goods across boundaries. Yet within Egypt itself, the density of monumental stone remains unmatched. The Nile, serving as conduit, makes possible the movement of blocks, but it is human vision that turns them into aligned forms on the plateau. At global scale, these structures coincide with other monumental traditions: megalithic circles in Europe, ziggurats in Mesopotamia, platform mounds in the Americas. Each reflects local responses to landscape and cosmology. Egypt's contribution lies in the marriage of stone permanence with river cycles, embedding celestial alignments in enduring architecture. The desert preserves what elsewhere would vanish. Tomb paintings retain their colors, pigments shielded from moisture. Hieroglyphs carved deep into stone remain legible after thousands of years. The environment harsh to life is kind to memory. This preservation allows the modern observer to reconstruct details of life and belief, though much is still missing. Not all inscriptions survive. Not all monuments remain intact, and many questions remain unanswered. Even with abundant evidence, mysteries persist. How precisely were crews trained? How knowledge was transmitted across generations of builders? How decisions were made about design? These are questions without final resolution, though fragments hint at answers. To stand within the frame of this history is to see stone as both burden and message. It is heavy, requiring labor beyond measure, yet it carries meaning across millennia. In Egypt, stone becomes the medium through which cycles of life, death, and rebirth are materialized. The river nourishes fields, the sky directs calendars, and stone anchors these forces in visible form. Together, they create a landscape where permanence and impermanence intertwine. As the Nile continues its flow, stone monuments remain, casting long shadows across the desert plateau. Their endurance speaks not only to human labor, but to a worldview in which time stretches far beyond the span of individual lives. The builders are gone, but their works still shape the horizon, silent markers of a civilization balanced between river, desert, and sky. Daily life along the Nile rests upon the steady labor of cultivating, grinding, and baking. Beneath the grandeur of stone monuments, survival depends on harvests of emmer wheat and barley, grown in fields enriched by the river's annual gift of silt. The cycle begins as floodwaters retreat, leaving moist ground ready for plowing. Farmers use simple wooden plows drawn by oxen to open furrows where seed is cast. The germination of grain depends on the delicate timing of flood recession, and failure to match sowing with this moment risks a poor yield. Irrigation channels extend from the river, carved by hand and maintained by communal labor, ensuring that water reaches farther fields as the ground begins to dry. Archaeological traces of these channels, faint depressions visible in satellite imagery, attest to networks of water management that endure across generations. When crops mature, harvesters cut stalks with flint-tipped sickles, gathering bundles that will sustain households until the next season. Central to survival is the transformation of grain into bread and beer. Grinding stones made of basalt or sandstone appear in every settlement. Women spend hours each day kneeling over these querns, reducing grain into flour with repetitive motions that leave grooves in both stone and bone. Skeletal remains from workers' cemeteries reveal joint wear and spinal stress consistent with this labor, a silent testimony to the cost of sustenance. The bread produced is coarse, filled with grit from the grinding surfaces, leading to heavy tooth wear observed in mummies and skeletal remains. Yet bread remains the staple, accompanied by beer, brewed from fermented barley loaves soaked in water. Nutritional analyses of residues suggest that beer was not only a drink, but also a source of calories and vitamins consumed daily across social strata. Lesser-known details emerge from excavations of workers' villages. At Giza, bakeries with large circular ovens and rows of bread molds show mass production of rations to sustain labor crews. Pots bearing traces of yeast and malt point to organized brewing, while storage jars sealed with clay stoppers preserve surplus for later use. Ostraca record distribution lists noting how many loaves and jars of beer each group receives. These finds reveal a logistical system designed to feed large populations where bread and beer are currency as much as nourishment. Even elites, surrounded by more varied foods, rely heavily on cereals, as evidenced by tomb offerings of bread loaves and beer jars. The diet, while sufficient to maintain labor, carries health costs. Studies of ancient remains show widespread dental abscesses, iron deficiency, and parasitic infections. Calcified cysts reveal schistosomiasis, a disease transmitted by water snails in irrigation channels. The presence of such parasites underscores the hidden dangers in what seems a fertile land. While bread and beer sustain, life water also carries illness. The balance between nourishment and risk defines existence along the Nile. Archaeological residues provide vivid details. Traces of lentils, chickpeas, onions, and leeks appear in hearth deposits, showing supplements to the cereal diet. Fish bones and bird remains add protein, while cattle, sheep, and goats are kept for milk and occasional meat. Honey and dates, rare and prized, sweeten the otherwise plain fare. Yet for most variety is limited, and reliance on grain is nearly absolute. The image of abundance is tempered by the fragility of supply. In years of poor flood grain, stores dwindle and famine looms. Relief inscriptions describe officials organizing distribution of grain in crisis, while tales from later periods recall the specter of hunger. The uncertainty of the flood magnifies the significance of storage. Granaries built with mud brick rise in village courtyards and temple complexes alike. Their domed silos preserve grain from moisture and pests, securing survival across lean years. At planetary scale, this dependence on cereals mirrors other river valley civilizations. From Mesopotamia to the Indus grain cultivation anchors, urban growth each shaped by different rivers, yet sharing the same reliance on seasonal cycles. The Nile's rhythm is distinctive for its predictability, more regular than the Tigris or Euphrates, yet still vulnerable to extremes. Tree ring and sediment studies reveal episodes of prolonged drought, sometimes linked to wider climate oscillations in the Mediterranean and beyond. These fluctuations remind us that Egyptian life is never isolated, but part of larger atmospheric patterns spanning continents. An unresolved mystery lies in the full extent of how ancient Egyptians managed agricultural risk. Records show sophisticated surveying and water measurement, but how decisions were made to allocate irrigation or store surplus is less clear. Were these choices local, communal, or dictated by centralized authority? The evidence is fragmentary, leaving scholars to piece together models from administrative texts and archaeological remains. What is evident is the centrality of grain as both subsistence and symbol. Tomb paintings show scenes of sowing, harvesting, and baking, inscribing the cycle of agriculture into eternal afterlife imagery. Grain thus becomes not only physical sustenance, but also a metaphor for renewal. Within households, daily meals are simple yet structured. Bread is eaten with onions, or fish beer drunk alongside, and sometimes vegetables stewed in clay pots. Hearths built against courtyard walls reveal the modest settings of cooking. Ash layers preserve impressions of baskets, mats, and wooden utensils now long decayed. These traces allow reconstruction of humble routines that form the base of civilization. Skeletal analyses from cemeteries further clarify diet. Isotopic studies indicate a heavy reliance on C3 plants like wheat and barley, with limited input from animal protein. This chemical evidence confirms what archaeology suggests: a diet dominated by cereals. The costs appear in health markers: shorter stature compared to modern averages, evidence of anemia and high infant mortality. Yet within these constraints, life endures, and communities thrive, sustained by bread and beer. A lesser-noted detail comes from a shell bead found far from the sea, buried with remains alongside food offerings. This small item, transported across deserts, suggests networks of exchange extending beyond the valley. It reminds us that even in subsistence economies, objects of beauty and distance hold meaning. Perhaps such items accompanied the daily ritual of meals embedding distant places into local lives. The Nile's floodplain, narrow yet fertile, sustains millions across centuries, but its gift is precarious. Without irrigation, without stored grain, and without bread ovens glowing in village courtyards, survival falters quickly. The question of endurance lies always in balance. At planetary scale, the agricultural landscape of ancient Egypt reflects the broader Holocene transformation when humans across the globe shift from foraging to farming. The cereal fields along the Nile are one chapter in this wider narrative, a shared human adaptation to climate stability following the last ice age. Yet here, the adaptation is uniquely shaped by a single river, its rise and fall binding every meal to forces beyond human control. The silence of skeletal remains the wear of teeth, ground down by gritty bread, the grooves in grinding stones polished by countless hours of labor, all speak of the cost of subsistence. These details, modest compared to towering pyramids, are the foundation without which no monument could stand. The unseen work of kneeling over querns, of tending irrigation channels, of kneading dough and brewing beer, sustains the civilization remembered for its stone. To live a day in this world is to feel the rhythm of hunger and relief, to depend utterly on the grain harvest, and to know that each loaf of bread embodies not only nourishment, but survival itself. Life along the Nile is sustained by grain and water, but the body carries the marks of both endurance and fragility. In cemeteries that line the desert edges, mummies and skeletal remains reveal patterns of health disease and treatment. Teeth worn by coarse bread bones, bent by labor, and tissues preserved by arid sand provide direct testimony to conditions endured. Archaeological study shows arthritis in joints, compressed vertebrae from lifting loads, and calcified remains of parasites. Schistosomiasis, contracted from irrigation waters, leaves traces in the bladder and liver. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and trachoma appear in bones and preserved tissue, reminding us that disease is as ancient as settlement. Alongside these burdens, there are signs of medical response. Papyrus texts describe diagnoses, treatments, and prescriptions, blending empirical observation with ritual incantations. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to the 2nd millennium BCE, lists remedies for digestive troubles, wounds, and fevers. Ingredients include honey willow bark and castor oil, some of which modern science confirms as antimicrobial or analgesic. Honey, with its natural antiseptic qualities, is applied to wounds. Willow bark, containing salicin, anticipates later use of aspirin. These details reveal a knowledge base drawn from observation, trial, and continuity, though inseparably entwined with spiritual elements. Physicians known as SWNW serve both palace and village, their practice encompassing treatment, ritual, and prayer. The boundaries between science and belief are not sharply drawn. Illness is often seen as intrusion by spirits or imbalance of forces requiring both medicinal and magical response. Amulets, incantations, and offerings accompany poultices and surgical tools. Excavated instruments including bronze scalpels, forceps, and probes show practical interventions. Trepanation. The drilling of skulls appears rarely, but healed bone suggests survival in some cases. The coexistence of physical treatment and ritual underscores a worldview in which body, spirit, and cosmos are inseparable. Mummification itself, though primarily a ritual of preservation for the afterlife, also reflects anatomical knowledge. Embalmers remove organs, treat cavities with resins, and wrap bodies in linen. In doing so, they reveal familiarity with structures of the body, even if their goal is spiritual continuity rather than scientific inquiry. The dry desert air enhances preservation, allowing modern scholars to trace patterns of health. Dental studies show abscesses, cavities, and heavy wear. Examination of hair reveals exposure to heavy metals, likely from environmental sources or medicinal use. In these remains, daily life and environmental exposure are inscribed on the body. Lesser-known details highlight the extent of medical organization. In Deir el-Medina, the village of workers who built royal tombs, ostraca record absences due to illness, with supervisors noting who is unable to work. Some absences are excused for days, suggesting recognition of recovery time. This administrative detail hints at structured management of labor and health. Tomb reliefs also depict scenes of childbirth, with women squatting on birthing stools attended by midwives. Archaeological finds include figurines of protective deities associated with fertility and safe delivery. These fragments offer glimpses of women's health practices less recorded in formal texts, but central to community continuity. A mystery remains in the interpretation of certain medical texts. Some prescriptions list ingredients that are unknown or symbolic, leaving scholars uncertain whether they refer to actual substances or metaphors within ritual practice. The distinction is blurred. Did ancient physicians truly administer every listed ingredient? Or were some words meant to invoke cosmic protection? The ambiguity reflects a different conception of medicine, where efficacy is measured not only in physical outcome, but also in alignment with divine order. Planetary scale forces also shape health. The proximity of water sustains life but fosters parasites. Flood cycles, while predictable, spread conditions tied to stagnant pools. Climate fluctuations leading to famine increase vulnerability as malnutrition weakens immune defenses. Studies of mummies from periods of drought and social stress show higher rates of disease, indicating that environmental instability translates directly into bodily fragility. The human body becomes a register of climate history. Ritual practices accompany attempts at healing. Amulets carved from faience or stone, inscribed with protective symbols, are worn against illness. Statues of household gods, like Bes, guard against childbirth complications, while incantations invoke divine protection. Healing is enacted not only with herbs and tools, but with words and symbols. In tomb paintings, scenes of offerings to gods associated with health and fertility reinforce the connection between divine favor and physical well-being. Yet even with these measures, mortality remains high. Infant burials are common, and life expectancy is shortened by the cumulative burden of labor, diet, and disease. Still, resilience is evident. Healed fractures in bones show survival after injury. Signs of recovery from infections suggest that community care supported individuals through illness. Such evidence tempers the image of fragility with that of endurance. Within households, remedies are likely passed orally across generations. Archaeological residues of herbs in jars, along with grinding stones stained by plant matter, suggest preparation of medicinal mixtures. Pollen analysis identifies chamomile, juniper, and fenugreek among species-used plants with known soothing or antimicrobial qualities. These botanical traces enrich the picture of daily healing practices rooted in the landscape's resources. The integration of ritual and medicine reflects a broader Egyptian worldview in which order, or mayat, governs all aspects of existence. To heal the body is to restore balance, aligning human health with cosmic harmony. Thus, disease is disruption not only of the body, but of order itself, requiring restoration at multiple levels. The desert preserves echoes of these practices. Medical ostraca, discarded but durable record recipes and incantations. Tomb inscriptions detail offerings made for healing or protection. Mummified remains carry scars of treatment. Together, they weave a record both precise and incomplete. The gaps remind us of limits in knowledge, yet the fragments are sufficient to show that ancient Egyptians confront illness with a blend of observation craft and faith. A lesser-known find underscores this blend. In a worker's tomb, a small figurine of a dwarf deity is placed alongside tools. Dwarfs were often associated with protective powers, particularly in childbirth. The juxtaposition of figurine and practical object captures the dual reliance on physical and spiritual measures. The unresolved question of how effective these treatments were lingers. Modern analysis confirms some remedies' usefulness, yet others remain doubtful. The line between pharmacology and faith is indistinct. Perhaps efficacy was perceived through survival rates, or perhaps through reassurance that the cosmos itself was enlisted in healing. Either way, the practice sustained communities through generations. At planetary scale, the Egyptian medical tradition stands as one of the earliest recorded systems of healthcare contemporary, with Mesopotamian texts and preceding later Greek medical theory. Its emphasis on observation, cataloging, and treatment provides a foundation, even if couched in ritual language. It illustrates the universal human response to illness, to seek explanation, to try remedies, and to embed healing in cultural meaning. Disease and treatment are woven into the rhythm of life and death along the Nile. To walk among the cemeteries is to see continuity of care and suffering preserved in linen wrappings and skeletal marks. Each body tells of work in the fields of bread ground, course of water, both life-giving and hazardous, of remedies applied with hope. Medicine ritual and the human body together form a record as enduring as stone monuments, but quieter preserved in the stillness of desert sands. Beyond the fertile ribbon of the Nile, the desert stretches in all directions, a vastness of sandrock and silence. It is here on the margins that traces of vanished voices remain preserved by dryness that halts decay. Tombs cut into cliffs, inscriptions etched into stone, and pottery shards left at ancient campsites survive where rain never falls. The desert, inhospitable to life, becomes an archive of memory. The arid air desiccates organic remains, leaving bodies mummified by nature, long before artificial embalming is perfected. Graves uncovered in shallow sand reveal hair skin and even clothing preserved for millennia, fragile witnesses to lives otherwise erased. These silent testimonies remind us that the desert conceals as much as it reveals. Much of daily life leaves no mark, while what endures is skewed toward the monumental or the accidental. Archaeologists uncover ostraca recording deliveries, fragments of tools and beads far from their origins, but the majority of existence vanishes in the sand. The silence is itself a form of record, an absence speaking of the limits of preservation. Lesser-known details emerge in remote places. In wadis that cut through limestone cliffs, rock inscriptions show processions of animals, names of travelers, and prayers scratched into stone. Caravan routes to the Red Sea leave behind cairns, pottery, and campsites faint signs of those who risked the crossing to reach incense shells or foreign timber. Shell beads discovered hundreds of kilometers from the coast testify to exchanges spanning deserts. These small objects carried in pockets or as ornaments hint at networks that remain only partly understood. Did caravans regularly link Nile settlements with distant shores, or were such journeys exceptional? The evidence is fragmentary, leaving mystery in the gaps. Shifting sands also preserve and conceal larger remains. Lost towns once flourished along trade routes, only to be buried when water sources dried or politics shifted. Excavations at Amarna Tel El Amarna's brief capital reveal sudden abandonment, with houses, workshops, and streets left behind. Yet elsewhere, settlements vanish, with no clear explanation, leaving archaeologists to debate whether drought invasion or shifting power caused their disappearance. The incompleteness of the record underscores the fragility of human presence in a harsh environment. Planetary scale change frames this story. As the Sahara undergoes cycles of aridification, human groups adapt, contract, and sometimes vanish from the landscape. Paleoclimate studies show that shifts in monsoon patterns, driven by changes in Earth's orbit, transform the desert from savanna to wasteland. Rock art depicting giraffes, elephants, and hippos survives in cliffs, now barren evidence of environments radically different from today. These transformations remind us that Egypt's deserts were not always so empty, and that the Nile Valley becomes a refuge as wider regions dry. To live in this setting is to depend on the river, but also to carry memory of lands once green. The unresolved mystery of precisely how communities navigated these shifts lingers. Did groups move steadily with shrinking water, or did sudden droughts force mass movements? Archaeological traces suggest both gradual adaptation and abrupt change, leaving scholars to reconstruct patterns from scattered clues. The desert holds not only physical remains, but also echoes of belief. Tomb texts speak of journeys across barren landscapes toward the afterlife, describing fields of reeds and rivers beyond death. The geography of belief mirrors the geography of survival. The river as lifeline, the desert as trial, the horizon as passage. Monuments placed at the desert edge, visible against the emptiness, mark thresholds between worlds. Even in silence, the land shapes imagination. Lesser-known sites, far from famous pyramids, carry fragments of lives. At Deir el-Bahari, tombs of nobles contain painted scenes of fishing fouling and banquets, images of daily life intended to endure into eternity. At Elephantine, near the First Cataract, inscriptions record expeditions southward, blending geography with ambition. These quieter records, less visited, broaden the picture of what Egypt was: not only pharaohs and stone, but also scribes, traders, and farmers inscribing their presence in modest ways. The desert's role as preserver extends to plant remains, textiles, and tools. At Kahun papyri survive detailing household accounts, medical texts, and hymns. Reed pens and ink palettes discarded and buried in sand provide evidence of literacy woven into daily routines. Without aridity, such fragile objects would have vanished. In this way, the desert distorts the record, emphasizing what it can preserve while leaving other aspects invisible. The stillness of preservation contrasts with the dynamism of living communities that once filled these spaces. Planetary forces continue their influence. Sandstorms shift dunes, burying sites while uncovering others. Climate oscillations alter rainfall at the Nile's source, shaping floods that determine whether valley settlements flourish or suffer. Egypt's history is inseparable from these larger rhythms of earth and sky. The human story is written within these cycles, its traces preserved or erased according to forces beyond control. The unresolved question of how many voices remain buried is unanswerable. Archaeologists estimate that only a fraction of ancient settlements have been uncovered. Entire villages may lie beneath dunes undiscovered. The sense of absence pervades the field. For every inscription, countless others are lost. For every preserved body, thousands have vanished. The desert both grants memory and enforces silence. Yet what endures is enough to reconstruct patterns. We know of bread ovens and beer jars of nilometers measuring floods of medical papyri, listing remedies of pyramids aligned with stars. We know of shells carried far inland of caravans that braved barren roots of families who tended fields at the edge of survival. We know of disease inscribed in bone and healing invoked through ritual. These fragments, though incomplete, weave into a tapestry of endurance against landscape and climate. To live a day in ancient Egypt is to rely absolutely on river floods, to work fields with relentless rhythm, to eat bread that wears down teeth, to risk illness from water, even as it sustains life, to move within a world where stone proclaims permanence and desert conceals fragility. The silence of the desert reminds us that most of these lives leave no trace. Their voices are gone, yet their conditions remain etched in what survives: monuments, skeletons, fragments of papyrus, and landscapes shaped by human hand. At planetary scale, Egypt is one example of how humans adapt to narrow ecological niches, binding survival to rivers in otherwise arid zones. The Indus, the Yellow River, the Tigris, and Euphrates each tell parallel stories. Yet the Nile's rhythm, steady across millennia, grants a particular continuity unmatched elsewhere. The civilization that grows along its banks is inseparable from this regularity, but also vulnerable when it falters. The desert silent and still is both backdrop and archive, holding traces of what the river cannot preserve. To consider these vanished voices is to acknowledge the limits of what is known. For all the precision of stone alignments, the abundance of grain stores, and the survival of papyri, much remains hidden in sand. Entire dimensions of thought, daily laughter, fleeting gestures, and private fears are absent. What we hold are fragments sufficient to glimpse, but not to fully reconstruct. The desert horizon, stretching endlessly beyond the valley, embodies this mixture of revelation and loss. As the sun sets over the cliffs, the stone of temples glows, the river darkens, and the desert swallows sound. In this stillness, what remains is not only the endurance of structures and remains, but the awareness that most voices are gone. Egypt's ancient world persists through fragments, preserved and concealed by the same forces that shaped its life. To stand in imagination at the desert's edge is to see both permanence and silence, to sense the enormity of what is lost and the resilience of what endures. The Nile flows still, though the people who first measured its floods and shaped its banks are long gone. What remains is a landscape layered with memory fragments of labor, belief, and adaptation woven into stone, bone, and sand. To walk through this record in imagination is to feel the rhythm of survival without illusion of permanence. The river that once determined harvests continues its course, yet the societies that depended on its cycles have shifted, dissolved, and been replaced. What endures are traces fragile yet persistent, silent yet eloquent. The mummies preserved in desert air, the grinding stones worn by countless hands, the carved hieroglyphs recording rations and prayers, all speak of ordinary and extraordinary existence alike. Each fragment is a remnant of people who lived within narrow margins of survival, tethered to water, vulnerable to climate sustained by cycles they did not control. The story of ancient Egypt is not only of pyramids and pharaohs, but of adaptation to a river's rhythm and a desert's silence. The stillness of the archaeological record contrasts with the movement it once represented. Boats skimmed the Nile carrying grainstone and timber. Caravans crossed barren wadis with shells, gold, and incense. Voices chanted hymns in temples aligned with stars. Now, those boats are gone. Caravans dispersed and hymns silent. What persists are marks in stone beads, in graves, inscriptions on walls, preserved by accident of climate and choice of material. The majority has vanished. Organic matter decays unless protected by dryness. Words spoken are lost unless carved or inked. Lives lived in fields, and courtyards are mostly invisible, leaving archaeologists to reconstruct from fragments what once filled entire worlds. The gaps are as telling as the evidence. To reflect on this is to acknowledge the limits of knowledge even as discovery continues. For each tomb opened many lie undiscovered. For each papyrus preserved countless others have turned to dust. The silence of absence is as much a part of the record as the presence of stone and text. Yet within these fragments is a continuity that links across time. The rhythm of agriculture, the challenges of disease, the blending of medicine and ritual, the alignment of structures with sun and stars. These elements, though distant in culture, resonate with the wider human story. Across continents, early societies faced the same fragility dependence on rivers, vulnerability to climate need for food, and search for meaning. Egypt's distinctiveness lies in its endurance, its ability to sustain patterns for millennia. But even here, change came. Dynasties rose and fell, floods varied, and sands shifted. Nothing remained unchanged. At planetary scale, the lessons of Egypt are reminders of how civilizations rest upon narrow ecological balances. The Nile's predictability allowed stability, but droughts tied to distant climatic oscillations brought hardship. Global forces beyond human control shaped local survival. The record of disease in mummies, the traces of famine in texts, the evidence of abandoned settlements all testify to this vulnerability. What remains unknown is vast. The methods of pyramid construction, the decision-making of farmers facing poor floods, the voices of women and children absent from formal texts, the details of songs, games, and conversations all are lost. These absences remind us that history is never complete, only glimpsed through what endures. The stillness of surviving fragments invites reflection not only on what is known, but on what cannot be recovered. To linger on this is to recognize the humility required in studying the past. Each bead, each shard, each inscription is a doorway to vanished lives, yet beyond it lies silence. That silence is not emptiness, but a reminder of the scale of human experience beyond our grasp. The continuity of human adaptation remains the enduring thread. People lived farmed, built healed, and buried their dead along the Nile for millennia. Their efforts shaped landscapes, erected monuments, and recorded thoughts that persist across thousands of years. The monuments may dominate the horizon, but the quiet details, bread ovens, irrigation, channels, amulets, and healing herbs are what sustained survival. In these small fragments, humanity's resilience is most visible. As night falls over the desert plateau, the stone of temples cools, the river reflects the stars, and silence deepens. The voices of ancient Egypt are absent, yet their world is present in what they left behind. To reflect in this stillness is to accept both endurance and loss, permanence and fragility. The past endures not as a complete story, but as fragments preserved by chance and climate interpreted by patient study and contemplated by those who seek connection across time. The river, the desert, the stone, and the sky remain witnesses to cycles of life and death. What is left is memory woven from fragments enduring in silence, resting in stillness. To extend beyond the final silence of the Nile's banks is to widen the frame to see ancient Egypt not in isolation, but as one expression of humanity's long experiment in adaptation. The valley's endurance, carved into stone and inscribed in memory, represents a balance struck between people and environment, fragile yet lasting. That balance, however, was not inevitable. It arose from choices, responses, and adjustments across millennia, shaped by climate landscape and the persistence of daily labor. The river dictated the rhythm, but people adapted to its cycles with ingenuity that blended practicality and meaning. In doing so, they created a civilization whose traces remain vivid even when voices are gone. The archaeological record, though fragmentary, allows glimpses of this adaptation across scales. A grinding stone polished by years of use speaks of household routine, while a pyramid aligned with stars speaks of cosmic order. Both belong to the same continuum, one grounded in survival, the other in vision. It is in the tension between these scales, the ordinary and the monumental, that the richness of Egypt's history lies. The monumental draws attention, but the ordinary sustains it. Without fields of barley, there are no temples. Without women grinding grain, there are no labor crews fed to build pyramids. Survival and monumentality are not separate, but intertwined. The fragility of this system is revealed when conditions falter. Droughts recorded in sediment cores correspond with famines mentioned in inscriptions. Shifts in flood patterns reverberate through granaries, markets, and palaces alike. Disease carried by irrigation waters spreads in periods of stress, further weakening resilience. These connections remind us that the apparent stability of Egypt across centuries was continually tested by forces both local and global. At planetary scale, Egypt's story is one chapter in the wider Holocene pattern, when rivers became centers of settlement and agriculture. The Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, the Yellow River, all anchor civilizations to water in otherwise challenging environments. The Nile, with its relatively predictable flood, offered a particular advantage, yet the fundamental reliance on water and grain is a shared human condition. To reflect on Egypt is to reflect on the broader human adaptation to rivers, to cycles of abundance and scarcity, to the fragile balance between climate and survival. Within this broad pattern, details of Egyptian life reveal specific adaptations. Bread and beer as staples, medical texts combining herbs, and incantations monuments aligned with celestial events. Each detail shows how communities wove survival into meaning. The wear on teeth from gritty bread is as much part of Egypt's legacy as the carved hieroglyphs on temple walls. Both are records of endurance, one inscribed on the body, the other on stone. The desert's role as preserver shapes what we know. In other climates, organic matter decays. In Egypt, dryness allows papyri textiles, and even food remains to endure. This preservation, however, distorts perspective, emphasizing what survives by chance. The abundance of funerary material contrasts with the scarcity of ordinary household remains, creating a picture skewed toward the eternal rather than the everyday. Archaeologists labor to balance this record, to reconstruct lives from fragmentary traces, to imagine households from hearths and storage jars. The incompleteness of evidence is not a flaw, but a condition of history itself. What is unknown is vast, and acceptance of this silence is part of the study. Unresolved mysteries remain integral. How exactly pyramids were constructed, how communities managed agricultural risk in lean years, how ordinary people experience disease and healing, these questions resist final answers. Each fragment of evidence suggests possibilities, but certainty is rare. This uncertainty is not emptiness, but richness, reminding us that history is not a completed account, but an ongoing dialogue between past and present. The silence of what cannot be known is as significant as the clarity of what can. Egypt's endurance is measured not only in monuments, but in continuity of practices across millennia. The sowing of grain after flood, the brewing of beer, the recording of rations on ostraca, the alignment of temples with stars, all persisted repeated generation after generation. This repetition reflects stability, but also necessity. To live in the Nile Valley is to live within narrow ecological margins. The repetition of practices is survival itself. Change occurs, dynasties shift, artistic styles evolve, but the fundamental reliance on river grain and community remains constant. The planetary cycles that shape climate continue still. The Nile's flow today, managed by dams and canals, differs from antiquity, yet the dependence remains. Water sustains life in the valley, and its control remains central to survival. This continuity links present with past, reminding us that human adaptation to rivers is not only ancient history, but ongoing reality. To reflect in the quiet of this extended view is to see Egypt as mirror of broader human experience. The Nile story is not only Egyptian, but universal, a story of adaptation to landscape of resilience and fragility of survival, shaped by forces beyond control. The monuments, though uniquely Egyptian, express a universal desire to endure, to inscribe meaning in stone against the passage of time. Bread, beer disease, and healing are universal too, expressed in local forms, but recognizable across cultures. The silence of vanished voices invites reflection on what remains unknown. Songs sung at harvest, laughter shared at ovens, words whispered in healing rituals. These moments are gone, unrecorded, unrecoverable. What we hold are fragments, beads, bones, inscriptions, and structures. Yet these are enough to connect across millennia, to glimpse continuity of human effort. To dwell on this continuity is to accept both presence and absence, both evidence and silence. In the stillness of desert and river, what endures is not a complete story, but fragments sufficient to remind us of humanity's resilience. Egypt's legacy lies not only in pyramids, but in the quieter endurance of daily life preserved in fragments and remembered through study. The closing reflection rests in stillness. The river flows, the desert stretches, the stone endures, the sky turns. Human lives pass, leaving traces fragile yet persistent. To consider these traces is to acknowledge fragility, endurance, and mystery together. What is left is memory woven from fragments, resting in silence, enduring in stillness.